view. Darwin, from my standpoint, is the foundation of that. And that is why we're going to turn our attention to his theory, because it is one of the primary theories that has been used to persuade people that we really don't need a God. It's one of the most influential theories in modern civilization, and we're going to take the time to examine it and ask ourselves, does it really match reality? Now, we have to do a little work here first, because it's important for us to understand, when we're talking about science, that we understand what we mean when we talk about three words: hypothesis, theory, and law. What are they? Let me give you just a brief, very brief example. And it may seem very simplistic, and it will be. Let's suppose that this represents reality. This is what is really real in the box. How does science approach trying to develop the truth claims about the particulars in the box? Normally, we begin with what we call a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a very early assumption based upon some limited looks into the box. Basic data. We build an early assumption that will allow us to begin to further investigate. If you investigate long enough and you examine the stuff in the box and it begins to confirm that hypothesis, we then move to a theory. And a theory is much more sophisticated, because a theory now begins to predict, based upon its theory, that when you reach down into the box at a particular place in a particular time, you will get data which supports that theory. Kepler, for example, and others have given us the truth claim about the orbits of bodies around the Earth and around the Sun and so forth, that we can predict that if we launch a rocket in this direction at this velocity, we will be able to land on the moon, not on Pluto. So a theory is one that allows us to begin to predict that the data in reality will match what our truth claim says. Eventually, we might work our way to the declaration of a law. And a law is a truth claim that is very broad, that says no matter where you reach within this realm, the reaches of the law, you will find this to be true, this to be true, this to be true. The data will match that law. Now, what happens if we have an assumption, a hypothesis, and we are gathering data, and all of a sudden that data doesn't match the hypothesis? What do we do, Jason?
We throw it out because it's wrong, or change the hypothesis.
Well, yeah, we throw it out or we change it. Why?
Because it's obviously a bad hypothesis.
And why is it a bad hypothesis?
Because it didn't give you the proper data when you
It doesn't match reality.
Right.
Correct? So let's suppose we've now moved to a theory. And we have a theory that has gone through that stage. And we are now to the point where we can predict data. And we predict and say, when you reach into reality here, you're going to find a yellow ball. And we get a green triangle. What happens?
Well, you check your testing, and then you go back to the hypothesis, because obviously your theory is bad.
That's right. First of all, you say, well, did we reach into the right place in reality and da-da-da? But let's suppose we did, and we pull out a green triangle. We go back and say, we've got something wrong with the theory. That's exactly what science does. Well, it's important for us to recognize that, because we have to deal with these words. And in particular, we have to deal with the word of a theory. That's what we're going to do. We're going to examine Darwinian evolution, and we're going to ask ourselves whether or not this theory does match reality. How does it stack up against reality? We have some incredible statements about this theory. Huxley said, Darwin's theory is no longer a theory but a fact. Darwinianism has come of age, so to speak. We are no longer having to bother about establishing the fact of evolution. What is Huxley saying about this theory? Now, he doesn't want to use the term law because that implies something very serious in the scientific language. But he's willing to call it a fact. Asimov. Today, although many educators play it safe by calling evolutionary ideas theory instead of fact, there is no reputable biologist who doubts that species, including Homo sapiens, have developed with time and that they are continually, though slowly, changing. Fact. Carl Sagan. Evolution is a fact amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. Natural selection is a successful theory devised to explain the fact of evolution. Now, Dawkins even goes a little further. He says it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked. But I'd rather not consider that. Now, if you are disconnected with what's going on in academia today, you will not realize that Dawkins' perspective is a perspective that is carried by many professors in our universities. For those students who come into the class believing that God is the transcendent creator, they are soon led to believe that they should be considered ignorant or stupid or insane, maybe even possibly wicked. So here we have this consistent picture that evolutionary theory is a fact. And it's the assumption of virtually all school textbooks. This is my daughter's college biology textbook. Let me show you what it says about this theory. The theory of evolution is no less reliable than is the atomic theory or the germ theory of infectious disease. As with atoms, which cannot be directly observed, we cannot directly observe the production of new species by evolution. Biologists have gathered a tremendous amount of evidence in support of biological evolution, however, and not one major piece of evidence has ever been obtained that suggests that it has not occurred. Conversely, the so-called theory of creationism proposes no testable hypothesis and thus cannot be proven right or wrong. Proponents simply accept it on faith. The theory of evolution, however, suggests many predictions that can be tested. Okay? This is an interesting statement by Dr. Berlinski. Let me just let you hear it to some extent in response to what we just saw in terms of the idea that, well, it's just these fundamentalist religious people who are opposing evolution.
The claim that all skeptics about Darwinian orthodoxy or Christian fundamentalists stands refuted by me. It's obviously not true. I'm neither Christian nor a fundamentalist. But lots and lots of people are skeptical in the scientific community. I know dozens of mathematicians who scratch their head and say, you guys think this is the way life originated? It's absolutely a preposterous theory. And many, many very significant figures. John von Neumann, one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, just laughed at Darwinian theory. He hooted at it. So it's perfectly absurd. This is a point in a polemical dispute. It's not a reasonable standard of criticism. Opposition to Darwinian theory is, I wouldn't say widespread, but there's a consistent group of people among mathematicians, among physicists, among some very good speculative biologists who simply don't accept it, don't even regard it as a scientific theory in any reasonable sense.
The theory is in trouble. What is really true? What are we looking at? Now, about a year ago, I was watching my graduate school. I went to Auburn University. And they were playing in the Southeast Conference Championship football game, and they were playing against the Tennessee Volunteers. And as we were watching this game, it was an important game, critical game, championship game. It was a close game, and the Tennessee team was close to the goal line, and the Tennessee quarterback dropped back and threw a long pass, and one of the Tennessee receivers leaped out parallel to the ground and caught the ball just before it hit the ground, and immediately all the Tennessee players screamed with joy, and all the Tennessee fans jumped with joy, touchdown, except something strange happened. At that moment, the Auburn players all immediately said, incomplete. And all the Auburn fans immediately said, incomplete, instantly. How is this possible? Was it a touchdown or was it not? Now, I was watching it, and I saw for certain that it was incomplete. The referees called it good, but they obviously missed the call. How is it that thousands of people immediately saw the same thing but concluded a different truth claim from it? Interesting, is it not? Well, what happens is that man has a tendency to see his own position. We need to be careful as well as Christians, that we don't simply just see what we want to see. Because quite frankly, folks, in this area of science, the data is pouring in. The deeper we look into space, the more close we look into the cell and everything else, the more we see and hear, the heavens declare the glory of God. You and I do not need to be afraid to look into a telescope. We do not need to be afraid to look into the microscope, because the evidence supports the truth of God. In fact, the more it pours in, the more there is developing a deep, troubling sense by those who see the universe as nothing but just a box. Now, there was a man who wrote a book in the 1800s, and his name was William Paley. An incredible man. And his book is titled Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature. That's when titles were very long. But William Paley, in this book, spoke of an interesting opening scenario. And it goes something like this. He says, suppose a man was walking through the moors, let's say forest, and his foot happened to dislodge an object. He picked up the object and he began to examine it. And he noticed when he pushed the little thing here that the lid opened up. And inside he began to notice that there were numbers, and a little small hand and a larger hand, and when he put it to his ear, he heard a ticking sound, and the more he observed it, he began to realize that it somehow kept time with the morning and the evening and the days. Now, William Paley said no one in their right mind would look at this and say, my goodness, look what the pine sap and the pine straw and the freezing and the thawing and the cold and the wind and maybe a little squirrel fur here or there have produced an amazing thing, don't you think? And Paley says no one would think that. Why? Because it is obvious to us that this is a pocket watch, and it has been created by a watchmaker. It was called, and is still called, Paley's argument for design. Well, there was another book, you fast forward now, 200 years approximately, and there is now a book written by Richard Dawkins entitled The Blind Watchmaker. Dawkins is attempting to refute the old argument of Paley, which for years was put in the dustbin, but now because of the evidence is being revised. And so in his book called The Blind Watchmaker, he says this: natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic processes which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. Now, this is interesting because we are now coming to the point where it is getting more difficult to cover our ears, to close our eyes to this noisy universe. Look at this statement by Dawkins. He says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Do you understand what he's saying? I know it looks designed, I know it looks like it had a purpose, but it doesn't. Interesting statement. Now, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, brilliant man. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Can you imagine this? A student in Dr. Crick's class? Dr. Crick is saying, repeat after me. It was not designed. It was not designed. It was not designed. Why do you have to do that? Because it looks designed. Can you imagine if the forensic investigator or the insurance investigator coming upon the scene and saying, boy, it sure looks like arson to me, but no, we can't accept that argument. Oh, sure looks to me like this guy was murdered, but no, we can't accept that. It has to be an accident. Do you understand what is happening here? The evidence points that someone started the fire. The evidence points that someone had a hand in this murder, but we will turn a blind eye to it. Why? Because we've shut ourselves off of anything outside the box. And so Dawkins and Crick and others are now in the mode of trying to convince us to say, look, repeat after me, it was not designed.